I'm really delighted now that we're going to move on to our first panel discussion. And I've seen that we've got Dr. Sarah Lewis here from Grow, Transform, Belong in the UK. We've got Alessandra Orofino from Peri Productions in Brazil. We've got Alex Duran from Galaxy Gives and Freedom Reads in the USA. And we've got Noah Shoshan from Rescaled in Belgium in Europe. So I'm just going to share my screen because Jacob and I have been having some wonderful conversations with all of our panelists, including the four I've just mentioned. And we've done a little, let's get back to my slides. Wordle, or sort of word cloud, based on their conversation, some of the key themes. And we thought we'd kick off this panel discussion by asking each of them to introduce themselves, but also to pick a couple of the words that came out of the word cloud to explain how they resonate with them and how they apply to their work. So yeah, we'd like to first kick off with Noah, please.
That was me, you said, right? Because I didn't hear correctly. Yes, perfect. All right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Noah. As Nina mentioned, I'm based in Brussels, Belgium, and I work with Rescaled. For those of you who might not be familiar, it's the European movement for detention houses. So we are a network of various organizations and individuals, from NGOs to academia to experts with lived experience to policymakers who are promoting the idea of more small-scale detention facilities and replacing large prison institutions with them instead. I've looked at this word cloud quite a bit. It was quite tricky to choose two words, but I think the first one that I really focused on was learning. Because for me, in my personal experience, learning is really core to the work that I do. And my experience and also motivation in learning so much from different contexts, but also from different experiences and different people, and also the way that we learn. And I felt that that applied to our sector, so many of you here in today's workshop, but also to the public opinion, so working with citizens at a local level, learning together, engaging in dialogue, and the same with at the levels of policy, for example, also learning together with policymakers and encouraging them to unlearn certain narratives and certain ideas and how they understand evidence. And I felt like learning connected to many of the other words, such as co-creation, lived experience, growth, leadership. And that sort of led me to my second word, which was choice. And I chose that one because I think we connect with many people oftentimes over shared values, and here we're talking a lot about human connection, but we each have different areas of activities and different areas of expertise. And I think you at some point you make a certain choice on what you focus on because it's impossible to do it all. And I actually like that idea of also asking yourself, why have I chosen this particular area in contributing to a more humane justice system, and also staying true to that choice in a sense, because I really believe that everybody has their role, and even with differing perspectives, we connect, as I mentioned, on these shared values, but we need each other to challenge and push and pull each other in the various roles. So that's why I chose choice. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Noah. I'm going to come to Alex next. Do you want to introduce yourself, Alex, and pick a couple of words from the word cloud and explain how they apply to your work and why you've chosen them?
Everyone, thank you. So great to be here. Again, my name is Alex Duran. I'm the program director at Galaxy Gives, a New York City-based foundation focused on transforming the United States criminal legal system. We focus most on decarceration, forging alternatives that do not rely on incarceration or policing, developing the leadership of directly impacted people, and just building power in communities that are heavily impacted by mass incarceration. Uh, Two words that really resonate with me are two words that weren't in my vocabulary when I went to prison at the age of 21, and those are lived experience and healing. I served 12 years in prison in New York State, and I think that, you know, ever since my country decided to put people in cages for committing a crime or transgressing, we've been trying to reform ourselves since then, right? Over 250 years. One of the things that I find most striking is that every single generation across American history has produced this contemporary version of reformers who have deemed this system to be a failure. And what gives me hope now is that the movement to reform it is now being led by those most directly impacted, and that wasn't the case, you know, kind of 3, 4 decades ago. And I think it's paramount to have people with lived experience leading it, because those are the people who have most intimately felt what it feels like to be inside of a cage. And at the same time, I think is of the utmost importance to focus on healing, because in order to have a more humane system, we need to heal both the person who was harmed, but also the person who committed harm. I recently co-produced a documentary called The Alabama Solution, which is about the Alabama prison system, and we were able to do this film because of smuggled cell phones inside the Alabama prisons. The story is told through the lens of incarcerated leaders inside of Alabama prisons, who have kind of bought a phone from a correctional guard, and it is through that work that we show that um, putting someone in a cage is not going to actually heal them. And if we are going to create a more humane system, I think that we need to have a system that's focused more on healing, and returning people whole back to their community. United States have one of the highest recidivism rates in the world of people returning back to prisons. And it's a system that is not keeping us safe. And until we focus on healing, I don't think we can have a more humane system. So those are the two words that resonated most with me.
Brilliant. Thanks, Alex. And yeah, if people haven't seen the Alabama Solution, I highly recommend you go and see it. I'm going to pass on now to Sarah, Dr. Sarah Lewis, who's on the call.
Hi, Nina. Thanks so much. And it's so wonderful to be here. And it's just been a beautiful session so far. So pardon the beauty pun, of course. But yeah, it's lovely to be here. And it was really difficult. This is like a sweet shop, isn't it? A sweet shop of beautiful words that really help us feel hopeful and feel the need to collaborate more. But I've changed my decisions a number of times, but the ones I'm sticking to at this moment in time is belonging and growth, which is kind of obvious maybe in terms of the work that we do. In terms of my work, I am the CEO of an organisation called Grow, Transform, Belong. So we are wholly, passionately, fundamentally dedicated to culture change across the justice system. We work across prisons, probation, third sector and approved premises, as well as do work in the community, in schools and raising awareness, and everything links back to culture for us. But we talk relentlessly about how do we, in every activity that we do, how do we engineer belonging? How do we engineer environments that enable others to feel that they belong? And yeah, it stands out for me because it is the end game, start with the end in mind. I think Simon Sinek talks about in his leadership work. And for me, I think creating environments where we can belong is really important. And certainly for me, when I did quite a lot of work as an academic over in Norway, looking at, I guess, the kind of principles of effective culture, which were called the principles of growth, which is what we use within our work. And it was a place where I felt belonging for the first time, and I felt that kind of fire in my belly, and I felt pain and beauty and all of those things that we've already talked a little bit about today. So belonging is definitely one of them. And then growth, it's got to be growth, really, just because I think that is our shared language. So we have our principles of growth, we have our growth methodology, a very, I guess, specific way on how to do things. So my my professional doctorate was all around co-creating, I guess, the way in which we relate to one another. So relationships within corrections, that's what I'm a proper nerd about. And so for me, there's something about growth wasn't necessarily just about how do we support the rehabilitation of people. I felt that was really quite narrow and didn't maybe acknowledge that there are some people that haven't been habilitated and some people that haven't committed the crimes they're in prison for. So growth was something that was, for me, universal around human flourishing, but it also very much incorporated not just those that live in prison, but those that work in prison and those that lead prisons. And we do a lot of work with all pockets of the system. And it is just about how do we grow people 1% at a time? How do we create safe environments? How do we co-create solutions? But the ultimate aim then is to belong. So growth is our how, and belonging is our end game.
Love that. Thank you, Sarah. And I'd like to bring in Alessandra as well to introduce yourself and to pick your 2 words and explain why you chose them.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. It's good to be here. Thank you, Nina, for creating this space for us. I'm Alessandra Rufino. I am speaking from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And I work with stories. I work with telling stories. I run a production company that has both a for-profit and a not-for-profit arm, and we create films, series, soap operas, and other narrative artifacts to tell stories that may not have been previously told or maybe not told in this particular way. My days are spent thinking about how these stories get told, who gets to tell them. I'm drawn to this conversation because I really think that the criminal justice system is in many ways caught up in a narrative problem. The people inside it tend to get flattened into categories, stripped of context, stripped of interior life. And what pulls me toward this work is the potential of storytelling to restore dimension, to build empathy, not as just sentiment, but as this kind of basic recognition that the person on the other side of the system has a life as full as anyone else's. So the words that I would pick here are definitely stories, narrative, and if I can pick a 3rd one, it would be empathy, because that is definitely the best thing that storytelling can bring us is a way towards empathy for people that we may not necessarily have a connection with in our private lives. And I think that is the case for some of the audiences of these stories. In my country, in Brazil, crime and punishment are a very big part of what people consume as stories. Brazilians are obsessed with true crime series. Crime and punishment play a very big role in soap operas and other popular narratives that people really engage with on a daily basis. And often the way that these stories are told really emphasize, again, the punishment aspect, and essentially bring the audience in as part of a vengeance narrative. That is usually the way these stories are told. And we've done a lot of research to figure that out and to understand the lenses through which people engage with narrative, particularly through film and TV, and have found that time and time again, these are the kind of tropes, the narrative tropes that really populate people's imagination. And interestingly, that even skews the worldview of people who may have people in their own personal lives who have been through the criminal justice system. So even the families of people who are on the inside and so on are often influenced by these kind of popular narratives. And the dehumanization that happens through that can affect large swaths of the population and ultimately can create a very fertile ground for politicians or other leaders that really build upon this kind of common narratives of vengeance. And as Alex said in his introduction, of kind of locking people up, putting them in cages, that kind of impetus is very much kind of built in the public sphere through these stories. And what we're trying to do at Peri is slowly and strategically try to seed other kinds of stories by leveraging huge narrative industry that we have in Brazil, the fact that we are not only a consumer of stories, but a very big producer of stories here in Brazil, to change that. So it's a pleasure to be here in such great company, to hear your stories, and to tell you mine.
Incredible. Thank you, Alessandra. I'm going to stop sharing my slides now, and I'm going to pass on to Jacob for the next question, if that's okay, Jacob.
Yeah, great. And what a privilege it is to have such a group of people to discuss building bridges to a more human justice system. I'm fascinated with narratives and stories as well, and I'm a true believer that the stories we tell today shape the future we live in tomorrow. But I'm not going to come straight back to you, Alessandra. I'm going to follow the same loop back around, starting with Noah, and ask you the question that dehumanization is a major barrier to a more human justice system. So how are you involved in deconstructing or dehumanizing those narratives, cultures, and models, and attempting to reconstruct new human narratives, cultures, and models?
Great question. Thanks, Jacob. So maybe it helps just to detail quickly a little bit what my work, at least in the day-to-day, entails as well. And so part of the work that we do is rethinking of when we really have to execute deprivation of liberty, instead of that being in a large prison where a person is merely a number and anonymous, and not only physically located very far away from society, but also just doesn't have access to their social networks, support systems, and so forth. And so what we're working on is really community integrated detention facilities that are not only located inside the community, but there's also an actual interaction and collaboration with the community. And so part of that work, a lot of that is lobby advocacy, but also looking into, what kind of evidence do we have for this type of executing deprivation of liberty. And when our network first came together, I think around 6-7 years ago, it was just a couple of volunteers with this idea of, what if it wasn't a prison, but a house? What if it was a house for 15, 20, 25 people? So that image of communal living and knowing each other and working with each other and having an idea not only about their name, but their story and what their needs are. And so since then, we only had this idea of the house being small, it being differentiated and community integrated. And along the way, a lot of support grew, and also questions of, okay, it already exists in practice, but we also want to do more of this. How do we do that? And we were asked, do you have an implementation handbook, or, what's the best methodology? What's the best model? What does it look like exactly? And the answer was, there isn't one unique model. There's a certain principle and theory behind it, but it's very much based on the language, the culture, the local context, the local needs and challenges. And so with that also came deconstructing narratives, because a lot of the terminology that we know of comes from prisons as we have built them and the systems as we know them. So understanding of this idea of rehabilitation, also what we mean when we say security and safety. Is security and safety bars and cameras, or is it actually someone working in such a facility or such a detention house knowing the other person and creating a safe environment through the relationship? So deconstructing that idea with multiple groups of people who are involved. So people who are incarcerated themselves, especially staff, especially policymakers as well, towards the public opinion. So a lot of that work has really gone into what does that mean, and taking away these labels. It's been mentioned many times today as well, not only labels placed on people, and that includes labels such as victim, offender, and prisoners, for example, but even staff profiles. So a security officer, if you call someone a security officer, you're telling them that their job is to keep the place secure, and they know how to do that through technology or closing a door. Whereas if you give them a different title, that also entails different expectations in terms of what is your role and added value here. So a lot of that went into deconstructing and reconstructing that idea, and also, again, the idea of what punishment is, or what can really happen in practice, and sometimes what needs are, which also includes, for example, the idea of soft on crime. That's a reaction that very often comes through, most often from politicians who think that's the public opinion. That's not always really the reality of what communities actually think when you work with them and when you learn together. But this idea that oftentimes getting to know each other, meeting each other human to human and taking all that with you is actually one of the hardest tasks to do. Oftentimes from experience, it's much harder to be in an anonymous place where nobody's really asking much of you. So actually this way isn't really soft on crime. It's actually one of the hardest things we can do together to also undo injustice and do justice and reconstruct all the different systemic ways also that, you know, we've harmed individuals, and sort of rethinking prison can only be this really, really harsh place of punishment where we just keep stripping people of their dignity. But also if we really do it, can it look differently? And we've seen that in practice. So that a lot of that work really goes into the narrative change, and that's a long-term goal. It takes a lot of time, but we can't do it without it, because we could put down a perfect quote unquote facility, perfect architecture, perfect handbook. There's a certain methodology. All that won't work if the narratives and the mindsets don't shift along with that.
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. And again, for everybody listening, the way we try to approach this workshop differently is by pre-recording episodes with all our panel speakers, so you can really go into a little bit more depth, and you can find those full-length episodes on the YouTube channel. Because I didn't personally speak with you, Noah, in the recorded interviews, but I already want to get into an hour conversation with you. But there's already an hour conversation recorded with Nina on the YouTube channel. And so thank you so much for that. One thing that we're doing, which I'd love to help with all our panel speakers and the rest of their panel, is at Common Ground Justice Project, we're polling the public to find where their common ground is on justice issues relating to punishment, and understanding what those core principles are, so we can have a better strategy when it comes to working with the public and with policymakers around what the public really want, and going beyond the basic opinions and to the principles that underpin some of those surface level opinions that usually get used in the sound bite media and hijack the stories. And I love the idea of a home, you know, shifting from, you know, prisons to homes, and more localized, need-driven places where people can feel at home. So thank you for what you're doing. I will come to who was next. It was Alex, if I follow the right cycle. Yeah, what are you up to, Alex, in terms of deconstructing, reconstructing, and moving towards a more human justice system?
Yeah, hi Jacob. You know, what Noah was saying actually resonated a lot with me, because when I read that question, I immediately thought about Eddie Ellis, who, as I mentioned in our last conversation, is someone whose shoulder I'm standing on. And he was a former Black Panther Party leader from Harlem who did 25 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. And in the early days of the movement, he put out this letter called the Letter on Language, which is kind of a canonical letter now for our movement, to basically tell the folks around us in the progressive movement to stop using dehumanizing language like animal, criminal, convicts, inmates, prisoners, and to use more censored, human-centered language, as you was noting, Noah. And I think that to me that's where it starts, right? Yeah, sometimes we can get a little hanged up on semantics and language, but when it comes to this issue, I think it's really important, because we're not going to pass any policies or make any change until we see people who have, you know, possibly committed harm as our neighbor, as our brother, as our, you know, sisters, as our mothers. And, you know, most people who go through prison are going to come home at some point. And we need to actually see them as part of our community. And using some of the dehumanizing language actually doesn't help. The other thing that comes to mind was, as I mentioned, I co-produced documentaries out on HBO now called The Alabama Solution. And there's a scene in the documentary where Sandy Ray, one of the subjects of the film, whose son, Stephen Davis, was murdered by a correction officer. And shortly thereafter, she walks into a diner in her hometown of Uniontown, Alabama, and sees her neighbor who's eating dinner there as well. And she tells him, Stephen Davis was just murdered by a guard. And this is a guy who had seen Stephen Davis grow up in the town. And he immediately, when he heard guard, he asked, so what did he do to go to prison? Right. And I think that for me, dislodging that notion that it's okay for someone to be brutalized or killed just because they're in prison is what I'm trying to deconstruct, because that is what keeps the systems of mass incarceration churning. If we think that we can do whatever, dehumanizing thing to a person who might have committed harm. And there's a lot of innocent people in prison, right? And if you think that you're just going to brutalize someone and then that person is going to come out to the community and be well and be whole, and then we're just fooling ourselves. I think we've moved tremendously the needle with this film, but there's so much work that we need to do among our own families, among communities, to see people who, for whatever trauma they had, they committed a crime, to see them as a full human being and not reduce them to the worst thing they've ever done.
Thank you, Alex. Yes, we are all more than the worst thing we've ever done. That's for sure. And Sarah, can I come to you next with the question of how we create better models, reconstruct our narratives, and what you're doing in Grow Transform to help us in that search and quest.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess maybe I started off doing one thing and I've kind of changed quite a lot maybe over the last kind of couple of years, just as we've learned, as we've kind of gone really. But in the last year, we've launched a campaign called Justice 2.0, and very much look at it from the point of view of engaging people that are all doing good work in the system, having some kind of shared language, but also getting lots of people involved in the conversation about how might we upgrade justice, and looking at it very much a bit like a mobile phone that, once upon a time I had a Nokia 360 and it was pretty cool. And but now not so. Now that we have upgraded, we've got rid of some of the bugs, some of the problems, and we've got a more effective phone that we now use. And that's essentially what Justice 2.0 is. It's about how do we make something that's more effective. But for me, Justice 1.0 is also putting stuff on the table that we tend to ignore. Restorative justice doesn't, and it does it beautifully. But for me, there's something about we need to start talking about the harm that happens in our prisons, the moral injury that happens, all those distasteful things, those problematic things that cause us injury, and the loneliness that we feel. I think just collectively across the system in some pockets of prisons, and invariably designed into the system really. So for me, there's something about getting stuff on the table and healing and reconciling that, and acknowledging that, and then together really focusing on key outcomes. So Justice 2.0 is all about how do we co-define, create and own Justice 2.0. It's not our movement, it's everyone's, but the outcomes that we, I guess, are trying to look at is how do we make our system more effective by focusing on 5 key things. And those things are compassion, seeing each other, so recognition, knowledge, and that includes knowledge, of course, absolutely central to our lived experience, communities, trust and courage, and those are the kind of outcomes that we really want to achieve through Justice 2.0. And so part of our work is about just sharing with others what are they doing around Justice 2.0. We have live events, we have podcasts through Growth Uncut. We have university students hijacking our social media to talk about what they believe Justice 2.0 is. But for me, there's something about creating that kind of very simple shared language, looking at the kind of Me Too movements, looking at other movements that have really got traction, trying to say to everyone, everyone's welcome to the party. This is the stuff that we believe is really important. So there's that umbrella campaign that we're really focusing on, but underneath it all, when I first started, I was like a bear. I was like, right, I'm going to get into these prisons and I'm going to co-create some solutions around culture change, and I'm going to make a difference. And with an incredibly passionate group of people in prison and staff in prison, we kind of co-created the first culture change program that we still run in the work that we do now on a much larger scale. But we have changed quite significantly over the last year. So I would probably describe us more as system designers. So we are very much looking at how, so for example, I'm looking at how can I redesign the standards around accreditation for programs in Scotland. We co-create programs that are all focused on flourishing, growth, humanity. We are redesigning training systems, not just delivering away days and ad hoc training. We're creating communities, so through our Champions community work in Europe and our growth project training in England, we are creating communities that are going to refuel and re-energize each other, and co-creating products. So it's about how do we create education that's really Gen Z, bite-sized, super engaging, super exciting for our staff, so that we can scale that and reach people at very low cost, but essentially internationally, so that we can share a very consistent message, which is all around how can we make our system 1% more compassionate, and how can we build trust a little bit more to serve our communities. And it's about how do we serve our communities, how do we create good neighbours, how do we support those neighbours in belonging. That's the kind of stuff that we're doing. So we've become, I was a bear and now I'm a bit of an eagle, with a system design kind of system design perspective, more so than I just thought I can't get around all the prisons. I haven't got enough time, so I can't get there, and I won't get there in time, so I'm going to have to scale up somehow. So yeah, we are very much focusing on how do we redesign things, how do we redesign the rule book so that people look at things that we're currently doing and thinking, wow, that's really problematic and that's quite unsociable really, and that's really distasteful. Yeah, a bit like smoking in the UK. We quit, we're not allowed to smoke now in pubs. It was unheard of, but we made it quite an antisocial habit through a very, very good campaign. And what I want to do is to create the same thing, but with Justice 1.0. And that language that Alex talks about, we're going to change that through the kind of work that we're doing. So that's the plan.
Excellent. And I'm sure we will all, love to hear more about that as it progresses. And the next question that Nina's going to be asking you all is, how we start moving towards, broadening those pockets of practice and moving the dial 1%, 2%, 10%. And so, but last but definitely not least, Alessandra, how are you involved in deconstructing old, dehumanizing narratives, cultures, and reconstructing new ones?
Yeah, so we started looking at the criminal justice system in particular, and narratives around it about 1.5 years ago. We did here at Pity a full round of research where we essentially looked at how people were reacting to existing narratives around this topic, in TV in particular. So we did actually some really interesting sentiment analysis of how these stories were told, how often they were told, and more interestingly, what moved the needle in terms of people's perceptions. And some really interesting things came out of that. First of all, I think documentaries like the one that Alex was involved in. I love the Alabama Solution, Alex, so congratulations on that. And I met your director at some film festivals around the world, so she was wonderful. But documentaries like that one do play a really important role in terms of informing people of different points of view, moving the needle in the public conversation. So that's one piece of it. Fiction and narrative have a very different role to play. And speaking about Brazil in particular, often narrative offers us the kind of tropes and characters and ideas that would then apply to our own lives and the lives of others around us. So narrative has a very similar role to play as religion, and kind of these stories that end up making the mythology of a place. And in Brazil in particular, our mythology is partly just Christian mythology, which is so important to Brazil, but partly it's soap operas. And that is a very interesting thing. I mean, in a way, the Bible and soap operas play very, very similar roles, and that comes out in the research. So that was fascinating to see. The other thing that we found out through that research is that people consume content, of course, nowadays because of streaming companies and so on and so forth. They consume content from around the world, but the content that moves their opinions and their points of view, in particular around this topic, tends to be local. So when we did our polling, some of our audience would have watched things like Orange is the New Black. That was really big in Brazil, that series. But then it didn't really change their view of this particular world, whereas local content, locally produced, locally sourced, with local characters speaking Portuguese, that had a very outsized impact on their points of view. So it's an interesting conversation to be had. Once we did that, we also did a round of qualitative research with writers and producers inside of the biggest companies in the country. And what we found there was really interesting. First of all, again, crime and punishment are a big part of the craft, right? Like they are big, that category is a big category in terms of how people navigate narratives and stories and how attached they are to the stories that they see. Writers and producers are therefore used to telling stories of crime and punishment. It's something that is part of their day-to-day. They, however, have no idea often that they are reinforcing narrative tropes that may be harmful in terms of the impact they have in public opinion. And once you discuss that with writers and producers, by and large, they want to do better. So this is a particular kind of industry that is very welcoming to the idea that we can do better and we should be doing better by our fellow citizens, by our communities, and so on. However, most people who worked in that craft have no idea how to do that. So we ended up creating a whole program to work with writers and producers to help them tell stories better when they already want to do that. So we've been doing some script consultancies for different writers' rooms here in Brazil, and we have created a few stories of our own that we hope to pilot, because once we have our own productions that are telling these stories better, we can then become the experts in this field. So this is the long game that we're playing, right? We want to be seen by fellow writers, fellow producers, as the ones who can tell these stories in a better light, in ways that are less harmful, but also in ways that are profoundly popular. We need to reach audiences, otherwise we're not going to be resources that people want to use. And we now have a series in development with HBO that I think is going to be a big hit. So I'm really, really excited about that. Production, as you all know or may know, takes a long time. These are projects that can last for years, from ideation to development to production to actually seeing the audience impacts. That takes a while. So it requires patience, but it can move the needle quite decisively as well. The other thing that we looked at that has to do with this, there's another type of content that people also consume that is not the kind of the long format, but is the chatter, right? Like it's the content that they consume every day on their phones through social media. And that's often content that is anchored in reality, the news cycle. But the way that certain events in the news cycle get signified, the values that we attach to them, the kind of public perception that we then either incite or don't incite is really crucial. And we did a whole assessment of the digital landscape on YouTube and Instagram in particular, which are the two largest social media platforms in Brazil. And what we found was actually fascinating. Most crime and punishment stories that people were consuming were coming to them through gossip pages. So the number one outlet for news in Brazil right now, that is not particular to crime and punishment, but to news at large, are gossip pages. when I say gossip pages, I mean Instagram pages where 90% of the content is celebrity gossip, so and so's plastic surgery, so and so's baby, so and so's wedding, and so on and so forth. And then maybe 10 to 20% is actual hard news. And there's a big chunk of that is actually crime and punishment, because it creates a lot of engagement. So these pages are drawn to the stories very naturally. And that's the kind of portal, the window for a large chunk of the Brazilian population into the criminal justice system. They will hear about prisons and people who have been to prison, and the families of people who are in prison, and so on and so forth, through those portals and through those windows. And the way that the frames are then showing up, and they show up every day, so over time that builds perception in a very decisive way, becomes really crucial. So we've actually created a whole project around acquiring some of these gossip pages. I see Cisa here on the call. I haven't even told her about this yet, but it's happening. We want to acquire a couple of those massive gossip pages that got to millions of people. We actually found the funds to do so, and we moved into an acquisition strategy. And the reason for that is that we want to experiment with the editorial. We want to be able to tell these stories daily to a massive audience of millions of people, and then see what happens there, right? So it's kind of the broccoli and the rice model. It's not creating the soap opera or the big storyline or the big documentary, but it's kind of engaging in that kind of everyday messaging exercise, and just putting a little bit of broccoli in that rice, right? Like people are consuming mass, or, I don't know, I'm a mom, so maybe that's why this image really works with me. But these are the things that people are already consuming, right? And how do we get inside of that and just very slowly start to sprinkle this kind of different seasoning, slightly different framing, slightly different mental models, so that we can hopefully move public perception. And we need to be really careful about how we measure that, how we see that, but hopefully, because these cycles are much quicker than kind of larger production cycles, that daily exercise can inform us about the mental models and the frames that actually work, so we can then apply them to the longer format, longer life cycle products. So this is kind of in a very technical way, but this is what I'm looking at and what I'm actually doing. But the ultimate goal, again, is very similar to the work that others have described here, is to really get into those mental models and frames in a way that can shift perception durably and can create the enabling conditions for better policy to then follow. Our theory of change is anchored in that, right? Like, we really do believe that without the right stories, we can get to better policies. Before a vote is cast, a feeling has to shift, right? Before a policy is implemented, a way of looking at the world has to change, and that is often subtle. And I think partly that's why narrative often gets overlooked, or is something that everyone is excited about but doesn't necessarily know how to work with, because it's very hard to measure the impact. And these things can be subtle, but again, at least in Latin America, they have become the stories that people are told and that people believe to be true about their own identity and about what works and what doesn't work in terms of public safety, and what should and shouldn't be done with people who have committed crimes. That has become a primary driver of policy and politics everywhere in the continent, right? So that is what we're working on.
That's amazing, Alessandra. And yeah, our conversation was incredible. And I really do encourage people to go to the YouTube channel and to listen to all of our panelists' individual conversations, to get into the nuts and bolts and the detail about, the incredible work that you're doing in so many different ways. We've got about 10 minutes left of this section, so I'm actually going to just open it up for questions and reflections, because there's been some great points made in the chat. So I'm going to pick on Ernst, if you're still with us, Ernst. You've been putting some of your reflections and thoughts. Just wondered if you wanted to share them, or if you had a question for the panel or for someone in particular.
Just in general, I think that these conversations are absolutely critical, and these perspectives have been, it is a global issue, and the more that we can build models, here in California, United States, there's been a focus on the Norway model, in the more humane treatment of the incarcerated particularly even their environments, the clothes they wear, the colors on the wall, um, the work that they get to do. And I think that's important. I think two pieces that I heard sparingly were the parts of where we talk about those who are harmed to have more their voice, um, as well as to what, excuse me for the noise, I live in downtown LA. So, but but the voices of those who are harmed beyond either punishment or nothing, right? This idea of a more collective idea, because when you talk to people who are harmed, they may have other ideas as to what that looks like because they have an investment as well as to the outcome of the person who harmed. And then the other idea of those who work in the system, I think that's very important. We tend to forget those. Uh, Here in the United States, you have higher suicide rates, abuse, drug use of those who work in the system. They're kind of like in the middle and they have to do what they're ordered to do as well. And that becomes part of their psyche, which is harmful as a human being to cage another person and to treat them as such. So I like the perspective of what I'm seeing and hearing to include all parts of society in this conversation to get to what is humane, right? The movie The Good Mile, or not The Good Mile. Anyway, there's a movie with Tom Hanks as the officer, and at the end, it's in his humane treatment, um, and the experience of that that really goes into that. Um, the transition of the movie, right? Not only of the person who was going to be executed, but also the officer who was dealing with that, right? This holistic look, I think, is powerful. So anyway, I'll stop. But thank you for the opportunity to be present and to hear these conversations. And I encourage everybody the different levels from documentaries. And last thing I'll say is that last part about what the average person consumes is critical because thoughts lead to language, which leads to policies, which lead to laws. And I love that mom idea of just a little broccoli, just a little seasoning, and changing the basic language because that's critical. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much. It's really great to see you again. I just want to come to, we've got a few sort of minutes. I just want to come to each of the panel members to ask you two brief things. One, what's the next step? Oh, so we're just going to come to Cisa. So just open it up before I come to my final question. Cisa.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll be very quick. I really love the images that people are kind of proposing here. So the broccoli and the rice. And also I really loved the Nokia, like the comparison with the Nokia and where we are right now. So I'm just kind of, one image that I often use is the comparison with the climate justice movement or the education movement at a global level. So these are movements that to some extent manage to coordinate themselves in the sense that, first of all, they perceive themselves as part of the same global movement. And there's some clarity in terms of what's the common agenda or the top priorities that we want to push as a movement. So I would be curious in kind of hearing your thoughts in terms of where we are as a global movement. Is it something that you perceive as new, or was it something that was already there? And that what are we exactly doing right now that is different from before? And what's the momentum that we can really kind of build on and catalyze? So that's my question. Thank you.
Perfect. And that was actually one of my final question I was going to ask as well, which was about, we're here sort of with this global dialogue, global movement. Why do you think working in this global way, is important, and how do we take that forward? And I also asked you to, in our conversations, we had lots of recommendations. I've put together a whole document with all the recommendations of books and podcasts and documentaries. So don't worry if you haven't been noting them all down. You'll be sent a document that includes a really amazing reading list and watching list from all our speakers. But obviously to think about a short quote or from something that you recommended for us. So thoughts on the global movement building this vibrant global movement, and final kind of reflection or quote. So I'll come to Noah first.
Thanks, Nina, and thanks, Sisa, also for the additional question. I've just come back from an international conference we organized last week in Albania, and I'm not here to talk about that, but what I did observe there was people came very early, and this is the second time that's happened to me. So we organize small things always here and there online in each country, but every 2 years there's a big international conference on our work. And this time around, the same thing happened to me 2 years ago. I'm frantically running back and forth, trying to do last minute things. And we say registration starts at a certain hour, and a lot of people show up half an hour before registration even opens. And so in that moment, you're sort of overwhelmed, and then you're seeing all these people, and they all took their time to show up early, and they're not nervous that the program hasn't started or whatever, and they don't even really where to register. Nobody's really concerned with that. I just see lots of people hugging each other from all corners of the world, and you can really tell there's such an urge to connect with each other, not only due to the various experiences and having the ability, and that also comes with improving access, of course, for everyone to be a part of these spaces, but also, and I think that's something that we really have to emphasize a lot, I think the benefit of this global interaction is there is already so much knowledge. There's so many skills. I mean, there's a lot of new evidence we can co-create, and some things that we might be missing and gaps we're missing, but there's a multitude of people and organizations and evidence that we already have. And it's really a matter of consolidating that, bringing that together and finding ways to translate it. So sometimes it feels like, we have to do these new things, we have to find new things, but actually a lot of it's already there. A lot of the power is there, a lot of the knowledge is there. And I think that's really the key aspect. And I think for us also the benefit of coming together and taking that, while then also realizing, and I like that Alessandra said that solutions are still local at the end of the day. To really drive systemic change and impact, you need to know, not only the language, because within coming together, we're all speaking English here now, but there's a language barrier oftentimes. It's also understanding sensitivities, understanding the culture. So doing that and then coming back to your local area, wherever that is, and seeing how can we now really embed that into our own spaces. For me, that's something I've observed, and in that moment I thought, oh no, and then I thought, how great is it that people are showing up early and just taking that time to connect. And then would you like me to share the quote now or later on? Now, okay.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, so you asked us to share a quote either from a book or from a poem. I'm not really that big on poem, but many, many years ago, I read Citizen by Claudia Rankine. I don't know if you're aware of it. She does slam poetry. This is, I think, already from 2014 or so it came out. And she details also the experience of being Black in America and what that entails. And it's written in a very, very special way where there's everyday situations to also stop and frisk searches, to the prison system, to football. It goes in various directions, and you reread many of these poems every time. But I just remembered one of them, which was about language as well. And since it's come up today, I thought that might be an interesting one to share as well. So basically, hold on, let me just see if I've gotten the right page. Here. So in one of the chapters, she writes, words work as a release, well-oiled doors opening and closing between intention, gesture, a pulse in the neck, the shiftiness of the hands, an unconscious blink. The conversations you have with your eyes translate everything and nothing. What will be needed, what goes unfelt, unsaid, what has been duplicated, redacted here, redacted there, altered to hide or disguise. Words encoding the bodies they cover. And despite everything, the body remains. And that really reminded me of this conversation about how important is language. And it's not really about, making a mistake or not being able to use a certain word, but about the content. And at the end of the day, the body and the soul remains and the person remains. And it's about meeting each other at that space and seeing what role language plays. So that's my quote.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you so much, Noah. And yeah, congratulations on your conference as well. That sounds amazing. Alex, final thoughts from you about this sort of vibrant global movement and community that we're building, and any other final thoughts or quotes from you?
Yeah, I think we've made tremendous progress in showing the world that this system is actually harmful. But I think, and this goes to the point that Ernst made on the chat, and he spoke eloquently about it too, is we need to build a vision of what that alternative looks like, right? Because the last thing that I thought about when I was in Rikers Island was the victims, the people who I harmed, right? Because I was trying to survive. I was waking up to clumps of my own hair because of my own stress. And when there's a system that is so violent and so brutal that every single day you're wondering if you're going to leave your cell and never come back, then you never really have the time to actually reflect on the harm that you yourself did. And we know that there are, restorative justice programs all over the world that actually work, that you sit down with the people who you most harm and you hear from them. And that's real accountability, right? When you hear from someone and you and they have a say in what they want repair to look like, right? We in the criminal legal system in the United States, we never do repair. We never do sorry. We just do harm. We continue to perpetuate the violence that we, committed to our communities. And real quickly, I'm just going to leave you with this poem, which I had taped on the wall to my cell for 12 years. It's called The Prison Cell by Mahmoud Darwish. It is possible. It is possible, at least sometimes. It is possible, especially now, to ride a horse inside a prison cell and run away. It is possible for prison walls to disappear, for the cell to become a distant land without frontiers. What did you do with the walls? I gave them back to the rocks. And what did you do with the ceiling? I turned it into a saddle. And your chain, I turned it into a pencil. The prison guard got angry at me, and he put an end to my dialogue. But he returned in the evening. Where did this moon come from? From the nights of Baghdad. And the wine from the vine years of Algiers. And this freedom from the chain you tied me with last night. The prison guard grew sad. He begged me to give him back his freedom. I'll leave you with that.
Beautiful. Thank you, Alex. And if people want to know as well why Alex has got Skittles in the background, they'll need to watch his conversation with us where he explains the significance of the Skittles. So yeah, do go and watch Alex's full conversation on the YouTube. Sarah, next to you for your thoughts on this sort of global vibrant community and how we move that forward, and also any final quotes or reflections from you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nina. I think there's something for me about the more we can connect and understand what each other's struggles are and each other's challenges are, I think the better. I think there are a number of people in this space that are working really hard and passionately as leaders to bring about reform. But I think the biggest threat for me is that, one, it can feel that loneliness, and loneliness isn't about the absence of people. I think it's about the absence of maybe feeling seen or feeling you're getting traction or feeling that you're making an impact. So for me, there's something about if we having sessions like this where we can convene, but also having those really strategic sessions where we can talk about what are you trying to achieve, how might we support that, how might we align to that, how might we share that, what is the bigger vision, and I think we know that, but what are those kind of key principles that are going to be common between us so that we can support and leverage and complement and add layers to the same argument but from different perspectives. And I think the minute we can do that, and that kind of united front, creating those kind of pathways to the same vision, I think the more we can boldly do that. In all the growth stuff, I could spend forever talking to them about why it's important to create a humane, joyful environment within a prison wing. And I've wasted a lot of time maybe doing that, but what we've done instead is just to say, do you know what, just give us a day on the wing, let's show you what it feels like, and then with that you inject the joy, you plan the joy, you co-create it, and there's a moment where there's no harm for that day, or staff smile for the first time, or you collect that kind of stuff. So I think getting people to feel the stuff that we're going through, you know, crime is emotive. I think reform has to be equally emotive, so that we are, you know, I don't think people see the beauty, and I see the beauty whenever I go into a prison. I see beauty in different people, but some people are blind at the moment because they're just so desensitized in light of the culture that we've created. So for me, there's something about getting in there unapologetically and demonstrating that love. So yeah, that would be me. And then in terms of my piece, it's actually a book that a senior leader gave me who is going through a real hard time at the moment, and he gave it to me, which, you know, just to read because he thought I might like it. And it's called Love is Just Damn Good Business, and it's by Steve Farber. So this is just a little bit about leadership. So it says, fear is a natural part of growth, and since growth, change, revolution, reinventment, whatever you want to call it, are all on the leader's agenda, then fear comes with the leadership territory. My contention is simple. Extreme leaders live in the daily pursuit of that fear, not for the sake of fear, not for the hell of it, but because they understand that if they are going to really change things, if they are really going to lead people in new ways of doing things, new ways of thinking, new ways of conducting business, new ways in creating relationships, new ways of working, then those new ways are by their nature scary to pursue. Why pursue them if they're all so scary? What's the extreme leader's ultimate motivation for sticking his or her neck out so frequently? Love. That's the simple, basic motivation for working through all that fear, because love makes the fear worthwhile.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you so much, Sarah. And yes, Alison will definitely, I'll add any of these new poems onto the recommended reading and listening list so that we can share it with everybody. Thank you, Sarah. That was beautiful. And finally, Alessandra.
Well, I think most of it has been said. I'm glad that we are having this conversation as a global movement. And this topic in particular is pretty universal. I think in many, everywhere around the world, we're trying to figure out how to deal with harm and reparations and people's, like, understandable in many ways, appetite for vengeance and blood, but the moral imperative to find other ways. And that is, I think, a conversation that people around the world can relate to, and different societies have found different answers, but the reality is that we're all grappling with the kind of very human aspects of this. And one of the questions was about that, right? Like, how do we deal with the people who have been harmed, and then their own needs and their own the options that are presented to them are also not satisfactory or fair in many ways. So this is, I think, where the global conversation can help us, because it can help us understand the kind of the universal aspects of this, while also knowing what's particular to our own context, and then bringing, of course, learnings, but also inspiration from others, and then applying it locally. You asked for quotes, and I was thinking about also poetry and beautiful things that I've read, but because I am the voice of kind of pop culture in the room, I wanted to bring a quote from a mainstream Hollywood film, and I thought that would maybe help us get our minds thinking along those lines. I'm going to quote from a film from the 90s called That Man Walking, which was a huge box office success. It has some real problems. It also has some real accomplishments, I think, particularly for the time. But there's one particular scene where the protagonist is this sister, is this nun, and Sister Helen, and she is meeting the family of one of the story. There's a teenage couple that was murdered, and she is accompanying and being kind of spiritual advisor to the person that has been convicted for their murder. And she goes and tries to meet the family, so the people who have been harmed. And it's a tense kind of part of the film where she's kind of thrown out of one of the family's homes, and then she finally meets the father of the girl who was killed. And they have this brief conversation about where he sits, he's sitting in this grief, his marriage has fallen apart, it's very hard for him to continue on living. And he says something to her along the lines of, I wish I had your faith, I don't have your faith. And she replies, I wish it were that easy. It's not faith, it's work. And I love the fact that inside of this huge cultural artifact, a film that was seen around the world, that again was a box office hit. This is not like a small auteur film that two people saw. This is something that became a real conversation piece and kitchen tables across the planet, quite literally, that they were able to put in something, a line like that very quietly does a lot of work, right? Like, because it says something about the work of thinking about other options, both for families that have been harmed and for people who have committed crimes, but frames it not as something that is just a given, that it will just kind of fall from the sky upon you, but something that needs to be worked on. So I think it's quite interesting what it does for the mainstream culture, and I wish we had more moments like that in mainstream and pop culture.
Incredible. Thank you so much, all of you. Jacob, do you want to wrap up this section for us?
Yeah, well, phenomenal. And I'm conscious that everybody needs to get into a break. We've all been sat down for a while, but yeah, fascinating. And I'm looking forward to trying to order everything that's running through my mind towards the end of our session and reflect on the day. But yeah, one thing that I've kind of is in my mind is about what Sarah and Alessandro and the rest of you have kind of spoken to a little bit, is about kind of how we organize ourselves, both regionally and globally. How do we prioritize goals and compare theory of changes and kind of be a little bit more strategic in terms of kind of what works, differences in terms of regions, and if we were to come together and prioritize agendas and strategies in alignment with regional theories of change and knowing what works, kind of what possibilities could emerge from that, especially with a pooling of resources and networks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to our first panel.